Welcome to 10 Minutes On. I'm Alex Clare-Young, Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer with the Joint Public Issues team. And joining me is Paul Morrison, Policy Advisor for the Methodist Church and also a member of the Joint Public Issues team. Today, we are talking about the spending review.
What on earth is a CSR?
So a comprehensive spending review, it is where the government looks at the departmental budgets, and it's not like a budget in which you make spending decisions for the oncoming year. It's looking at departmental budgets for the next 3 years. So it's essentially a planning document. It's not the actual spending decisions will be legislated for in later budgets, but we're looking at what each department is likely to spend over the next 3 years. And by and large, they're a really good thing, because one of the real temptations of government is to think about next week's headlines and to make spending decisions in the short term. And thinking out 3 years has got to be encouraged. And it seems it's kind of a brave thing to do as well, but it's a positive thing to do.
No, absolutely. I can see that. So one of the things that obviously we're really, really keen to think about in terms of this is poverty. So what can we tell about priorities on poverty from this?
Well, the first thing to say is it doesn't include the sort of benefit rates and particular individual benefit decisions. But if there was going to be substantial changes, either positive or negative, you'd see them in there in some way, and they're not. The path in terms of benefit spending is fairly much as was planned, and that means fairly big cuts for people with disability. There may be some leeway to do things around the two-child rule, which stops the third and any other children in a family from getting support from the benefit system. There may be some scope in that, but it's not written in. But there is going to be what's called the Child Poverty Review is going to report in November. Nobody thinks you can shift the dial significantly on child poverty without spending some serious money, and that money's not in there. So we look in hope to November, but that hope isn't being fanned, particularly by this document. I think there's some positive and some negative in there. There's definitely in there, which is that local government has some funds, and it was given those funds out in dribs and drabs by central government for various different schemes over the past 5 years, and they were always renewed in an annual or even sometimes a 6 monthly basis, so local authorities couldn't plan. That money they've just said it's going to continue, which we all thought it would, but it wasn't guaranteed, and it's been given in a tranche so that local authorities can plan, and it's a Poverty and Resilience Fund. And that's brilliant that local authorities get that ring-fence funding and they can plan and they can spend it well. And that's great. The downside for local authorities, though, is that a big chunk of their spending, a big chunk of the spending that is suggested in this spending review, is from year-on-year 5% increases in council tax. And council tax is probably the most regressive tax that we have. It's based on the values of property in 1991. It was an emergency system that was put in place after the poll tax failed. For people old enough to remember the controversy over that. And it's a temporary system that's lasted 35 years. And it was always awful. And the longer we go, the more awful it is. And if you're relying to get big amounts of money out of it, it's really incumbent on you to make it fair. So it's a really bad tax. It hits the poorest the hardest, and it's enforced appallingly. Lots of threats of going to prison, which are only occasionally carried out. But it's an awful tax. And it's being relied upon, which is a problem.
That's really helpful to hear and understand, Paul, because as someone who, I shouldn't dwell on this too long, but as someone who was born in 1991, I just feel like it's always existed. So to hear you refer to it as something that should have been temporary just really makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah.
As someone who was born a long time before 1991, I feel very old, and I'd like you to move on to the next question before
Sorry
I
about that
cry.
one, Paul. So the next thing that I thought would be good for us to think a little bit about is international development. So, the aid budget's been cut quite a lot in this, hasn't it?
Yeah, essentially, the biggest loser by a very long way is the aid budget. And quite a lot of the aid budget actually goes to refugee support within the UK. So actually, the amount of the aid budget that leaves the country is even smaller than the headline figure. We were proud when we reached 0.7%. We are going down to 0.3%. That's lower than it's been since this at any time this century. So there was a choice made, and would our interaction with the outside world be based on spending money on aid or spending money on defense equipment? And the big winner, or one of the big winners, is about £14 billion worth of investment in essentially new defense technology. So submarines in particular, but also refurbishing our nuclear weapons stock. And that feels very much like a movement in the wrong direction. It also feels very strongly that lots of people in this world who need support are not going to get it, or less people who need support are going to get it because of these decisions. And that's not something we should be proud of.
Absolutely. And in terms of budgets that have gone down, I was speaking to some rural leads this morning, and they had some concerns, particularly about the DEFRA budget, but a bit about housing as well.
Yeah, so there is quite a lot of spending on housing. So the government has huge ambitions in housing. Whether that's enough spending to meet, there's a certain amount of skepticism about that, but it is an increase in housing, and it's substantial amounts of money. But the other big loser, or nowhere near as big a loser as the international aid budget, but it's probably the next biggest loser, is DEFRA. And we don't quite know how it's going to make it, but most of DEFRA's budget is money that goes straight out again to farms. So that grant funding pot is going to reduce. We know there was already an intention to revise it, but the intention to revise it will be with a cut. We now know that. I think we suspected it, but that's what's been budgeted in. The other thing that really affects rural communities is transport. And there's a small amount of sort of capital investment for stuff in transport, but the actual day-to-day budget is going down, which means things like subsidy for rural networks. It isn't possible to make a profit out of it. So you have to pay people. Even if you're not running it yourself, you have to pay private companies. And the budget to do that and the scope to do that is predicted to decrease, which again will have big effects in rural communities.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there are lots of relatively small changes. Has anything kind of significantly changed, or any of our kind of hopes around some capacity realized? Or
I think the big change is in international development, and I think, as we said, we view that as very much a step in the wrong direction. And what the government and the state does isn't really going to change. It's going to have the same sort of scope of what it does. There is no real intention in here of addressing the big inequalities and the rising wealth inequality or difference between rich and poor in terms of income. There are lots of structural issues that have caused our economy and our society difficulty, which increasingly bite, that really aren't addressed in here and would need to be addressed in here. If they're going to be, they would need to turn up. So in terms of, this is very much, we are moving steadily forward. But for those who are looking for transformational change, it's not really in there.
Absolutely. And so to kind of round us off, Paul, bearing that in mind, why should churches care? And is there anything that folks should do?
So churches should care because, this is all sort of putting money in different pots that it's going to eventually be spent on services to people in our communities. But they really matter. So how those are spent really matters, because we have seen what happens when benefits get cut. We end up in a place where, around about 3 million people are being fed by trussed food banks, which are mainly in churches. That one flows from another. The other thing is, I can remember one of the first JPIT conference, and maybe I should do an ad that there's one coming up in November. The first JPIT conference, the main speaker said that the most moral document you have in your life is your bank statement. Where you choose to put your money says a lot about what you prioritize and what you value and what you care about. And this document published today says what our state values and cares about. And if that aligns with us, well, great. If that aligns with your views, well, great. But I don't think it does, especially in terms of aid and especially in terms of its ambition to tackle poverty, in which case you should care and you should join Constituency Action Network. You should do all the things that we forever tell you. And you should also pray, because positive change is often rooted in prayer and reflection.